everywhere, right? We're just not going to enforce that part of the law, and we're going to let states kind of do what they want on this issue. So California has, you can go and purchase it in those dispensaries. Colorado, I can't remember if Oregon and Washington, what the rules are there. But so in some states, Colorado is trying to use itself as an example to other states of, positive tax revenue, maybe the things that are on this, things are safer. The marijuana you can buy at a dispensary may be safer than something you buy on the corner, or whatever, right? And then in regard to how local governments, how states collect taxes, we rely on sales tax to fund state government. Some other states rely on income taxes, and it depends, it's across the board, right? And then of course education as well. All right. So one way of limiting the federal government, as I've mentioned probably 80 times by now, is through those enumerated powers. That was what the Federalists argued would be a constraint on the national government. But as we'll talk about going forward, that you will see that the Congress and the federal government, through interpretations by the Supreme Court, are given a lot of wiggle room or leeway into exercising powers that they don't they're not formally given in Article 1, Section 8, all right? And then the 10th Amendment recognizes that a whole host of other powers do exist, but those are reserved to the people, to the states, and therefore not the federal government, all right? We've talked about that already. So, for example, all right, so to regulate, that Congress are given the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So what does commerce mean?
Trade.
Trade between who?
Between two nations.
Two nations, right? Okay, or between individuals, among states, absolutely. What else? So is it just the trade of goods? I give you money for some stuff? Or does that mean transportation? Does it mean the manufacturing of these goods? Does it mean regulating like the workplace where people manufacture the goods? What all does commerce mean, right? So this is written in, it's vague. Like, who can look at this and say exactly what that means? People are going to make arguments for what they think interstate commerce mean, right? And then among the several states. So the court has interpreted that to mean interstate commerce, or commerce that happens between the states, where intrastate commerce, or commerce that happens only within the state, is left to the state to regulate. But again, those are very vague terms, and it's up to the Supreme Court to define exactly what those contours, what the rules are, right? Okay, so transportation, manufacture, production, or sale of goods. All right. You do not need to write these down. All I want you to recognize is that the federal government has those enumerated powers, the reserved powers, education, most certificates and licenses, public safety, and then concurrent powers are like taxing, spending, borrow money, things that both levels of government can do. Okay. So throughout American history, at the beginning, when the federal government and the Supreme Court was trying to establish national supremacy, you're going to see some cases where almost all aspects of commerce fall under the federal government's exercise of regulating interstate commerce among the states. And then as we evolve into this an era of dual federalism, there's a very strict reading where sometimes the court interprets interstate commerce to mean only transportation. Other times they find that it doesn't count as transportation. Other times it means that you can regulate like child labor. Other times they say it cannot. So it depends on what court we're looking at, what time period, and things can matter. All right, things can change rather over time. All right. So Gibbons v. Ogden and Swift Company versus United States, they found that interstate commerce could also be regulated if it was also part of interstate commerce, where it eventually fed into lines of commerce that crossed across state lines. But in this case was kind of where U.S. v. Lopez. The federal government passed like a law that banned like handguns in public schools, and ultimately the student was being charged under it, and they appealed to the Supreme Court. And the argument is the federal government had power to do this under the Commerce Clause, but it was only kind of very loosely related to that because it affected like the safety of neighborhoods and the ability of businesses to be successful and other things. And the Supreme Court, through a more narrow reading, said that this is not a legitimate use of federal power. Don't worry about too much about that. All right, we'll come back now. All right. So that 10th Amendment, that is where the reserve powers are found. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this is simply recognizing that reserve powers do exist. All right? Actually, we're going to skip that one too. I feel like I beat that one to death. Okay, so assumptions are made in creating this new system about human nature that each individual is rationally self-interested and that every person is looking out for number one, themselves. So by fragmenting power, and you have separate institutions sharing power at the federal level, theoretically at least, the president would want to control the agenda, but so would members of Congress, so would like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, so would Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. So there would be this tug of war constantly in trying to set the agenda and define and decide what government is going to do. And because of this ambition of advancing oneself and trying to be the most powerful, this is where Madison said the system creates a system of ambition checking ambition. And this is where the concept of like three equal branches struggling for power, even though they're not, but it was intended to be a restriction on all these institutions of government. And then by dividing power among the states, the same can be true of local governments, right? Of state governments. They want to properly exercise power left to them, meaning those that are not given to the federal government. And in my Texas class, we talk a lot about lawsuits and how Texas, especially under Barack Obama, had a very contentious relationship. And states sue the federal government for trying to wade into areas that are supposed to be under their reserve power, 10th Amendment powers. Everybody following what I'm saying? Okay. Fantastic. So therefore, states are a check on the national government. National government is a check on the states. And within the national government, the separation of power system is a check on each of the federal branches. All right? So we're going to be moving on here shortly to discussing the eras of federalism and the disputes over what level of government gets to exercise what power. So depending on what book you look at, sometimes scholars will break federalism up into like, I don't know, 5 or 6 eras. We're not going to mess with all that. We're just going to kind of break it up into 2 eras. Dual federalism, and then later on cooperative and coercive federalism. All right? So during this early era, under this new federal constitution, of course the states existed the way they always had. So you had disagreements arise between states and the national government over who was supreme. So under the Articles of Confederation, which level of government was supreme? The states were under the Articles, yes. And now under this new Constitution of 1787, now the national government has supremacy over certain areas of policy, over certain exercise of certain powers, right? So especially in the South, these regional splits exist. So there's regional splits, North and South, as well as divisions between the national government and the states over who gets to exercise what power. All right? And as we will see, the Supreme Court defines the contours of the federal power to establish it as supreme over the states. All right? So I don't know if y'all talk about this in U.S. history or not. But, so during the first administration, there was Mr. George Washington. You have Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. I think there's a play about him. Oh wait, so do we know who these dudes are? The guy on the left, that's Hamilton. Who are the other two dudes? Jefferson.
And Aaron Burr.
It's not Aaron Burr, that's a good guess. So that's the second Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall. I believe that's Jefferson's cousin. They weren't friends. Anyway, so Hamilton and George Washington and the other Federalists in George Washington's administration, those who believed in an energetic government, strong national power, and then there's Jefferson, the Secretary of State, who was an anti-Federalist, right? So Hamilton proposes the creation of a national bank to be established by Congress. Except Jefferson and Washington agreed, and then Jefferson says, but wait, we've ratified this Constitution. That is not an enumerated power given to the federal government. It mentions nothing at all whatsoever about the power of Congress or the national government to create a Bank of the United States. But they do so anyway on a 20-year charter, and then in 1811, that is when it's a sunset law. Eventually, the law goes out of date, and they allow the Bank of the United States to close. So 5 years pass, and government begins to discuss the creation of a second Bank of the United States. All right. Boop. So by this time, local banks, regional banks have been established, and they do not want the competition that would come from having to compete with a national bank. So Maryland, among other states, they pass laws to place a tax on this second national bank of the United States because they want to make it less competitive with their own banks within their state. So James McCullough, who was the head cashier, or like the president, if you will, the person over in charge of the money, at that particular branch within the state of Maryland, said, I'm not paying you jack crap. I'm not paying a tax on anything. Hold on 1 second. I'll let y'all finish right. I realize I've updated it and I'm using the old one. Hold on 1 second. There we go. So, James McCullough, the head cashier, person in charge of the money, refused to pay the state of Maryland, right? So, is there doubt that, as we kind of glanced at the concurrent powers, Maryland, obviously has the power to tax, but the National Bank of the United States, that's a federal institution, right? So 2 questions were asked before the Supreme Court. Was first, did Congress have the authority to establish a national bank? Remember, Jefferson brought this up back in the early 1790s. And he said that is not an enumerated power that the federal government has, right? And the second question was, did Maryland law unconstitutionally interfere with congressional powers? So, can Maryland tax a federal institution? So the Marshall Court, and Marshall was a Federalist. He believed in this new system of government. He was with Hamilton and Washington as far as political support. And he said, first, that Congress could establish a national bank of the United States, a second national bank, because they were exercising implied power. Was that mentioned? There was, enumerated, concurrent, and reserved powers. Where did implied powers come from?
Necessary and proper clause.
The necessary and proper clause, absolutely. So Marshall, in his interpretation of the Constitution, found that in Article 1, when it mentions Congress has the power to pass any laws which it in fact deems necessary and proper to the carrying out of its other power, that is where implied powers or wiggle room is given to Congress or the federal government to do things that are not explicitly listed in Article 1, Section 8. But the power that they exercised, according to John Marshall, existed contextually within the enumerated powers. So the federal government has the power to tax, has the power to print money, has the power to borrow money, spend money. So therefore, contextually, within and exercising their implied power, contextually that authority exists because it is related to the carrying out of their other powers and exercising of their other powers. All right? So this gives Congress all of a sudden like a check, if you will, to kind of do whatever they want going forward, as long as they can claim at least that a reasonable relationship exists between what they're doing and some other power they have in the Constitution. Think back to the Affordable Care Act, and they can require individuals to purchase health insurance because of the Commerce Clause. Remember? Anyway. And then, can Maryland tax a federal institution? And ultimately, the Marshall Court said, hell no, they cannot, because a state is inferior to the federal government, and because we've already established that through the necessary and proper clause, that this is a proper exercise of federal power. Therefore, through the supremacy clause, that is a legitimate exercise of power, Maryland cannot ever tax a federal institution because the federal government is supreme, and that the power to tax, according to John Marshall, involves the power to destroy. So a state would never, when the federal government is exercising legitimate power, be able to tax a federal institution or override something that the federal government is doing. So this is helping establish national supremacy in this relationship with the states. Maryland cannot tax a national institution or the national government. And it allows for Congress and the federal government to also exercise powers that are not explicitly listed in those enumerated powers. All right. Does anyone have any questions about this? All right. So this is just a snapshot of everything we've talked about. I'll give you just a moment. I've already covered it. Yes, sir.
Oh, is there a copy of the PowerPoint on Blackboard?
No. No, sir.
Like,
Otherwise, you would pay attention even less. Like people would not come to class, or I don't mean you specifically, just in general. Yeah. But feel free to take pictures or do whatever you want to be successful.
No, with everything that was covered with the review, there was something that helps, right?
What's that?
Like the review, like if we gotta review stuff, we have to what's not on Blackboard.
Mm-hmm.
What we need to review is like something that we did for us, right?
I'm not sure what you mean.
You'll have a review that basically help us.
For the review, I don't like to type one up or anything, y'all can come to class. I'll give you a little bit of time before the exam, like one or two class periods before, to ask questions. And that's kind of how we do review. Yeah. Is everybody good there? Daniel, you good? Mm-hmm. All right. So in this case, we're going to watch a little video because I yap too much. So this is about the case Gibbons versus Ogden. All right.
The Industrial Revolution brought about a huge economic boost for the United States, but this rapid growth in manufacturing and commerce raised serious questions about congressional and state powers when it comes to regulating commerce in the states. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution gave Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. But in the early 1800s, the national government and states were testing the boundaries of national power related to the regulation of the economy. One important case that helped to define some of these boundaries of the Interstate Commerce Clause was the 1824 case of Gibbons v. Ogden. To understand this case, we must first understand some background. In the early 1800s, New York state law gave certain individuals exclusive rights, or a monopoly, to operate steamboats on the Hudson River. In other words, the New York State Legislature decided which boat operators gained New York business. Aaron Ogden was one of these boat operators. Thomas Gibbons, on the other hand, a boat operator himself, wanted a piece of the action. He held a federal license to operate a steamboat between New York and New Jersey, so he began to do so. This violated the New York state law, and Ogden filed a complaint to stop Gibbons' operations. Eventually, the Supreme Court agreed to decide the controversy. Ogden, of course, argued that New York state law gave him the exclusive right to operate over Gibbons. Gibbons' position rested on the idea that the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause gave the federal government exclusive power to regulate commerce between the states, and the Supremacy Clause made the laws of Congress take precedence over state laws. In a unanimous decision, the court sided with Gibbons. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion for the case, naming the New York law invalid because of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. The court's opinion held that Congress had the power to regulate any commerce between states, and further defined commerce by including navigation of the waterways. Since shipping was interstate commerce, or commerce between the states, it was subject to regulation by the federal government, not the states. This decision supported the growth of a national economy rooted in free enterprise and competition in the marketplace, rather than monopolies granted to benefit specific individuals or companies. It also supported federal supremacy over state laws as granted under the Constitution. This case would have far-reaching implications throughout the 20th century, as Congress passed nearly any law under an increasingly broad definition of interstate commerce. The rise of the internet and online commerce has continued to develop the idea of interstate commerce, leading to persisting controversy regarding the relative powers of federal and state governments. For more information on this and many other important court cases throughout history, be sure to check out the other videos in our Homework Help series.
Okay, what? So this step once again reaffirmed Congress's power over the states, and is further established and defined what Congress's authority is in regulating interstate commerce. And progressively, well into the 20th century, through broader interpretations of the Commerce Clause, depending on what kind of Supreme Court, a liberal or conservative one, that we had, the court defined it more narrowly or broadly to incorporate more and more different kinds of commerce that can be regulated by the federal government. Okay. All right. So as time goes on, moving toward the Civil War, through the 1820s, 30s, 40s, you see the westward expansion from the 13 original colonies into territories which eventually become states, and you see increased population people coming from like Europe, especially at the end of the 1800s, right? Where most of the population centers were in the north, where the south had smaller populations and tended to be obviously a rural economy. So worries in the south was that with more and more people living in the north, that is where the House of Representatives would get most of the representation would be from the free north. But then they have the Senate to act as protectors of those southern states, and they did not want an imbalance to take place, right, between north and free states. So that's where you have the Missouri Compromise in 1850 to remain a level of equity among all the states in the Senate. So if they're going to lose out in regard to population, eventually, as more and more people are moving into the north, they want to maintain a level of equity in the Senate by not allowing more free states to outweigh the power of those in the institution of slave states. All right? And as we will see with anyone that's making their argument, you have individuals who will try to find a way to justify their argument for anything, whether it's Barack Obama and the Democrats for mandating everyone have health insurance, or it's nullifying tariffs, interpreting the Constitution in a way that fits a narrative that you want. Okay? Someone say something? No? Okay. Everybody good there? Oh, okay. Oh my God. So that's John C. Calhoun. He was a senator from South Carolina and Andrew Jackson's vice president. So, excuse me, I think it was in the 1830s. So, again, keeping in mind this relationship that had existed under the Articles, and states maintaining an attitude of them liking to exercise a lot of power, because during this time, the federal government was kind of limited in the stuff or areas of policy that it was involved in. Mostly it was about regulating trade with foreign nations, and the bureaucracy in the federal government was relatively small. So with the passage of a series of tariffs in the 1830s, states were upset because they viewed some of these tariffs as being borne most by or being burdens on the southern economy. So, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina was a proponent of this interpretation of the Constitution that said that the United States, the federal government, was a government of states and not of people, right? So therefore, under the state compact, states had the authority to nullify federal laws if they believed that they were unconstitutional. So this is going back to a time when we had which Constitution? The Articles, absolutely, the Articles of Confederation. Because now, even then, as now, the United States, the federal government, is a government of people and not of states. All right? So he said, because those in South Carolina were very upset about these taxes, that they viewed were a burden on them, and they would have to bear the brunt of them. Therefore, South Carolina declared null and void these federal tariffs. So they said on imports and exports, we're simply not going to collect taxes and we're going to ignore them. So what does the federal government say? Well, eventually John C. Calhoun resigned, and Andrew Jackson, who during this era presidents were not particularly powerful, Andrew Jackson is one of the exceptions in the 1800s of a powerful president. Anyway, so Andrew Jackson said that if South Carolina, the people there, did not abide by and carry out federal law, which is his responsibility, he got approval from Congress through the Force Act to use military action against South Carolina. And ultimately, and this is foreshadowing the states' rights issue in slavery, Civil War, the issues of states' rights that are foreshadowing the Civil War. All right? So ultimately, Congress repealed the former tariffs, changed some of the language, made South Carolina sort of happy, and then they were able to move on. But this is all building up toward, again, the Civil War. So can states, can they nullify federal law? No, they can't. Okay. So as I've already highlighted, the Chief Justice during this founding years, he's not the first Chief Justice, but he certainly established many precedents for the court. All right? So the decisions of the Marshall Court, excuse me, were supportive of establishing a relationship and exercising of power between the federal government and the states. All right? So establishing national supremacy over time. With the recognition that implied powers do exist with the creation of a national bank, giving the federal government wide latitude to regulate interstate commerce, even that includes shipping, excuse me, and I already highlighted national supremacy. I'm trying to keep everything straight. But when it came to the Bill of Rights, those limits placed, like for freedom, the government cannot limit freedom of speech, freedom of religion, quartering troops in your home, limit the Second Amendment rights, all those things which we'll talk about more later, those did not apply to the states. That was simply a restriction on the federal government. So the states, in theory, could do whatever they wanted to their people. They could recognize fewer or even more rights if they wanted to. All right? So this is important to keep in mind going forward, is that the Bill of Rights, things included in there, all the ones enshrined, those applied only, in this founding era, applied only to the national government. So during this founding era, the federal government was very small, mostly focused on regulating trade with other nations and protecting the homeland. And I want you to keep in mind, as we move forward, that when disagreements arise between states and the national government, or when we talk about civil liberties, individuals in the national government, it is the federal judiciary who's in charge of answering these questions. All right? So they define the contours, or what the law is, what the Constitution means when it says, regulate commerce among the several states. All right? So during this era, after John Marshall dies, from just prior to the Civil War, well into the 1930s, you have a Supreme Court that reads, like the Commerce Clause, for example, very narrowly, and places considerable limits on the ability of the federal government to do things that it interprets to be in the sphere of the states. All right? So they find, the court did, that a line existed, and that federal power was very specific. Those enumerated powers existed only to the federal government, and if they're trying to exercise any of that implied power, or things left to the states, they were going to throw out federal law. All right? So this is where you see, with industrialization leading up to the Gilded Age, this massive expansion of enormous monopolies in big business, because oftentimes the federal government is limited in their ability to, through things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, of being able to break them up, and going forward, the federal government limiting states and doing a lot of things as well. So the era of big business. So among other things, the national government was free to exercise power dealing with defense, trade with other nations, war and other diplomacy, immigration. Those are powers that are specifically given to the federal government. Some of those, as I said, that are open to more interpretation, like the Commerce Clause, they read them very narrowly, and a restriction on federal power regulating the economy, which is largely left to the states. So state governments are allowed to, establish an education system, a court and criminal justice system, public safety, they manage elections. Those are things that are left to the states, and in order to make changes to things like elections, amendments to the Constitution are necessary. All right? So they use this in strict interpretation of the Constitution to strike down tons of federal laws well into the New Deal, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So when the federal government tries to outlaw the transportation of goods across state lines that were produced with child labor, the Supreme Court struck that down. In trying to break up monopolies through the Sherman Antitrust Act, they struck that part of that down, right? Maximum hour laws and minimum wage laws at the federal level, they struck those down. There was a case called Lochner versus New York, where the Supreme Court, through something called, so we have due process, which if you're being arrested for a crime, they have to read you your Miranda rights, right? You have a right to remain silent, you have a right to an attorney. If you can't have one will be provided for you. And if you're being charged with a criminal offense, you have a right to a trial by jury, right? So that is due process. Those are due process rights. So every person has to be treated the same through these processes. The court, in the Lochner case, began expanding through something called substantive due process, or the court creating or recognizing the rights of individuals to do other things, liberties from government. So like when New York, for example, limited the number of hours that bakers could work, like in New York City. And keep in mind, these bake shops were like under the ground, and they were disgusting, and they had dirt floors, and they had, bread kind of stacked everywhere, and cats were peeing on it and laying on it, and it was just disgusting. Anyway, and it was hot and messy. So New York said that it's not a very safe environment for bakers, right? So they go down there, and the cat's laying there, and it's hotter than hell, and they work 80 hours a week. So they placed a cap on the number of hours, a maximum hour law, that bakers could work because of the harsh working conditions. But Lochner sued because he said, if I want to work 80 hours a week to make a living, you're limiting my ability to contract and to make money. Even though, I'm walking around in cat crap and life sucks. That's my way of pursuing happiness, if you will. So he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, through substantive due process, that the right to contract exists within you, the individual, and the federal government or state government doesn't need to be involved in that. Because if you're willing to work more hours, you should be able to without the federal government or the state government getting in your business. Isn't that interesting? Obviously now we have the 40-hour work week. Things have changed since then because of broader readings of the Commerce Clause, but they struck that down, saying you cannot put a cap on how many hours an individual could work. Same thing could be said of minimum wage. If a person's willing to work for less, they should be able to do so. Yes?
Just wanted to ask the class a question. How many people here have worked over 40 hours in a week?
You've worked more than 40 hours in a week?
Yeah.
Doing what?
I work at Chick-fil-A.
Chicken sandwiches.
Holy shit.
Now, what's worse is when you put in more than 40, but you're on salary.
Yeah. In my Texas class, we were just talking about like this overtime rule where Obama tried to double the threshold. Like you had to make less than $23,000 a year to be eligible for overtime pay. So he doubled it from like $413 a week to like $900, and people went ape. Like the state sued Obama, like small businesses sued Obama because they didn't like this rule that he sort of just made up and said this is the law. Because they said that they can't afford to pay it, so that leads to layoffs and a bunch of other things. So is it helping workers? Maybe a few, according to conservatives, but they have to lay off other people to cover those costs, right? Anyway, we can move on. All right. What time do we get out of here? Oh yeah. Okay. So, we're going to transition during the Great Depression to another era of federalism, but I want to make a distinction real quick. So when we talk about federalism, sometimes you will hear these eras referred to with this cake metaphor, all right? So the era we're talking about right now, or dual federalism, is called layer cake federalism. So the Supreme Court has been very strict in interpreting what the enumerated powers are and those reserved powers. So the federal government cannot wade into areas that are left to the states. That this line of icing, if you will, exists between the top layer and the second layer, and that does not need to be crossed for any reason. That relationship is desirable. So that limits the national government and its ability to tread on the states. All right? And then there's marble cake federalism, when we're moving into a new era under Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal. This is where we refer to as marble cake federalism, because all of a sudden a relationship begins to exist where states and the federal government, states rely on the federal government for money and for helping them fund projects and programs that benefit their people, that benefit their citizens. So then you start to see a more broad reading of the Commerce Clause. You see all sorts of laws dealing with like 40-hour work weeks and federal minimum wages and all these other things that we've highlighted. So then that opens the floodgates for the federal government to be involved in all sorts of new things. Okay. It's hot in here. Jesus. All right. Yeah, that's true. I have to, otherwise I get antsy. All right. So the Great Depression, right? So we see a level of connectivity. At that time, the world is more connected than it's ever been, right? Way before the internet, before TV, before all that stuff, right? And when an individual, so when the economy, is on the verge of collapse, and people are losing their jobs, people have gone broke. If worker on the assembly line who works and goes and eats at a diner a few times a week, and who lives in a boarding house, and who maybe has a wife or has some kids, when they're laid off from their job, they can't go buy food at the market anymore to cook on their little hot plate. They cannot go buy things at the store. They can't pay their boarding house lady. And now these effects are felt throughout the economy, where all of a sudden money in people's hands no longer exists. They can't buy things, so you get stagnation, or economic activity no longer happens. Commerce or trade stops happening. So what does what does government do to respond to this? Herbert Hoover said that regulating the economy is pretty much left to the states. There's not a lot he can do. Roosevelt comes along and says, screw you, Hoover. I'm going to wield immense power as president. I'm going to use federal resources and federal programs, and I'm going to help free you from this Great Depression. So, the federal government, along with states, the federal government begins spending mass amounts of money, running up deficits, because obviously the federal government isn't taking in a lot in income taxes, because people don't have freaking jobs, so the federal government has to start borrowing money. And the goal is, through public works programs, providing jobs to individuals, they spend, let's say they got like $50 a month. They got to keep 10 of it. They had to send the rest back to their family if they were off fighting war, or if they or if they were having to go somewhere else in the United States through part of the TVA or paving Camp Bowie Boulevard, whatever, right? So they were finding anything almost to get people into a job so that they got money so that they would go spend it. So states did not have the resources to spend state dollars, which there were, people losing their homes, all sorts of things. There just wasn't money to be had. So states looked to the federal government, and Roosevelt ran on this platform of swift government action to solve these problems. So a relationship began where the states began to rely on the federal government for money. If it comes to building roads, federal grants. If it comes to funding education, federal grants. If it comes to Medicaid later on, federal grants. All right? So this is an era of what they refer to as cooperative federalism, where the federal government becomes involved in all these kind of areas that usually are the purview of the states through money. So sometimes the federal government will place some stipulations on money in order for states to get the funds, but then the states could do a lot of whatever they wanted with it. Okay. Any questions at all? Okay. So you see a change because Roosevelt, in passing these New Deal legislation, right? You have this old school Supreme Court who believes in that division of authority, limiting the national government through its interpretation of the Constitution. They had 4 conservatives on the court who voted consistently against Roosevelt. So he threatened to pack the court with liberal justices to override them. And of course, people were calling Roosevelt a dictator, leading the United States into socialism, all sorts of things, things we kind of hear today with Barack Obama, or recently rather. So ultimately, after he threatened to pack the court, you have those 4 justices all of a sudden voting to sustain or uphold New Deal legislation. And that was the case forevermore. They call it the change in time that saved 9, which we'll talk more about later. So then now the court has become a liberal court all of a sudden and reinterpreting the Constitution to uphold a lot of federal statutes, a lot of federal power. All right? So you see an abandonment of states' rights in the 10th Amendment in some cases. All right? So as it exists today, as we talked about, remember when we talked about the Affordable Care Act, that they were trying to withhold all federal dollars for Medicaid? and they refer to it in the question as the largest grant and aid program. So, from cooperative federalism, federal money being sent back to the states through these big grants of, hundreds of billions of dollars. And that helps states fund programs to solve public problems, right? With, Medicaid, for example, it's about alleviating the plight of the poor by providing them with health insurance, right? So Texas alone, in I think it was fiscal year 2017, got $270 billion back from the federal government that we sent to Washington to collect some things like income taxes. And then they turn around and give us back a portion of it, and they usually redistribute some of our funds, in some cases, to poor states like Mississippi. All right? And don't write all these down. This is just highlighting some of the areas of how money flows back to the states through federal spending and through block grants. Okay.
Hey, wait. I just want to take a picture since I think it's...
Two kinds of grants. There are multiple. There are formula grants. There are multiple. But the two I wanted to focus on, in particular, are dealing with federal mandates connected to money. Okay. So categorical grants became more and more common, where if states don't have to take this money, but if they do, the federal government is going to say where this money has to be spent. So depending on where you live, if you have of some of these formula grants to pay for things like Medicaid, because we need more resources to fund our large population of the working poor, right? Anyway, so categorical grants, those are more restrictive, and they mandate to states where they have to spend money. So if it says you have to spend this money on school lunches, you can't spend it on textbooks. So this is a way of the federal government forcing states in a level of uniformity across the board of spending money or allocating resources in certain places that are valued by politicians in Washington. So when we get to folks like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, who believe in sending more power, giving more power to states, this is where you see the federal government shifting to block grants being more common, where there are some strings still attached to federal dollars, but instead of being really specific, they basically say that, okay, here's this money, here's $100 billion, that's for transportation, because they argue that the states know how best to spend that money, where resources need to be allocated, because those are local state problems, and they can solve them better than the federal government. All right? Any questions at all? Oh, man. Everybody good there? Does anyone need another moment? You do? Okay. So who in here thinks Texas is going to legalize the marijuana? Ooh, man, some hands went up. Okay. Like soon or later? Sooner or later?
Later.
They're actually already doing it now. They're already doing it now. So as of right now, they actually have medical doctors and facilities that
10 years.
prescribe low-end THC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but it's more if you go between the border of Texas and Oklahoma. Because in Oklahoma actually has dispensaries out there.
That's what I heard. For medical purposes, right?
Medical doctors have always been like daddy's never changed. Like they've always been able to.
No, they're able to do it, but they can't prescribe it in the state that doesn't allow it.
No, they can.
Well, now,
Like they always do.
See, no, I'm pretty sure you're correct on the end, because Alaska, from my experience, was the first state to allow medicinal use of marijuana, but there was no way to obtain it because we had no way to prescribe it and we had no distribution. So even though it was technically legal to use for medical purposes,
There was no place to buy it.
there was absolutely no way to get it. Yeah, at all, even medically.
So through grants and aid, almost $1 in $5 spent by state governments comes from the federal government. All right? And states and localities rely on that money in order to fund things like public education. All right? So we've gone from cooperative federalism, where states and the federal government work together to solve problems collectively, and the federal government tends to pay more of the bill. All right? So when you look at funding for Medicaid, so the largest expenditures in our state are Medicaid, education, and transportation, like roads and bridges and infrastructure stuff, right? And we rely on this money, and we're going to watch here in a few minutes. We're going to watch a little video about like Dan Patrick telling Obama to go to hell about funding for education. We don't need your money. Yeah, we do. All right. Don't worry about that second. Does anybody need one more moment? Okay. Okay, so Medicaid, right? So Medicaid was created back in the 1960s as part of a program under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. He went on a televised joint session of Congress and said that his administration does here and now declare unconditional war on poverty in America. So in his attempts to alleviate poverty, make life better for citizens, through all kinds of like environmental regulation, beautification acts, Johnson signed in a crap ton of federal legislation. But this partnership is one where, in effect, the federal government can't force states to create this, but they can kind of make life difficult if they didn't. So states create Medicaid programs, and the federal government has some stipulations. So if you get money, there are some stipulations, like a floor, if you will, of services that have to be provided. That if people meet certain criteria, it's an entitlement that like everyone is eligible for if you meet their criteria. All right? And states are in charge through, in this case, our case, the Texas Commission on Health and Human Services, in carrying out Medicaid, or implementing it, if you will. All right? So states can expand like above the poverty line to cover more individuals. They can provide more services covered by Medicaid. Usually you will see those in states like California, more liberal states. And sometimes you will see more local resources for healthcare, like Austin, for like public hospitals and things. Right? Anyway, so in fiscal year 2017, Texas spent $15.8 billion of our state dollars on Medicaid, and the federal government spent almost $21 billion. All right? So the federal government pays most of the bill. Texas has to put in a portion of it. So Texas does have to pay something, and these kind of relationships, usually the states have to pitch in a percentage of the total. So not only is the federal government kind of forcing states to participate in these things, but it's also kind of hijacking, since they have to pay part of the cost, hijacking their state dollars, and where they want, maybe they want to spend them elsewhere, but they can't because they're tied to these resources. These resources are tied to these programs. So it's a way of creating a level of uniformity as mandated by the federal government across all the states. Yes?
My question. So this says that Texas pays 44%, U.S. pays 56% government. Okay, which means that in Texas you're paying 44% per se, like you're paying your part towards your 44%, and then the rest of the nation on top of that has a little bit added on to pay for the rest of your 56%, because technically it's the taxpayer who funds the government.
The federal government, yeah, it's everyone collectively.
So,
So like income taxes, import taxes, things like
yes.
that. Yeah.
They're not gonna
So
make
it's just raising taxes everywhere else.
Well, it's not going to be free. You know,
Yeah.
nothing's free. You got to pay for it.
Yes.
Whether you know it or not, I mean,
Yes.
it works out. Now, I got a question. Medicaid, what's the difference between Medicaid and Medicare?
Medicare is for senior citizens in particular. CHIP is for children. Medicaid is for like working age adults who are impoverished. Yeah. All right. So where are them monies at? Them Benjamins. So this is just highlighting that where do our monies come from to pay for Medicaid, right? So this is looking for the next 2 fiscal years, biennial fiscal years of taxes. So we have changed, we've cut how much we're putting into Medicaid ourselves, but I believe there's an increase of $2.8 billion coming in from the federal government, right? So you don't need to write any of this down. I just wanted to show you what we're putting in versus the federal government, 33 versus $49 billion, all right? Okay. Do what?
No, so what we stop putting in is because the federal government's gonna basically match that.
No, I don't know how the formula works. I can't answer that. I don't know if it's like if the federal government increases spending that Texas is supposed to increase spending. That part I can't answer.
No, but like in the graph you just showed right there. So
Yeah, we've cut our state contribution.
And then the federal government
Has increased.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't think that's related. It just happens to be the case. All right. Okay.
Wait.
So.
I'm sorry. No. Yeah, I'm talking to myself.
Oh.
Sorry.
So the era we're in today, so you go from cooperative federalism, where the federal government has some stipulations, but over time you see this relationship with Benjamins and dollar bills, where the federal government starts mandating to states things they have to do. One example is the Affordable Care Act. And they can't force states to do things, but if they want to receive those federal dollars, there are certain requirements or things that they want states to do. They want them to create health care exchanges, expand Medicaid, pass laws that require employers to cover or provide health insurance if they meet certain criteria, right? Excuse me. So they assert their will on the states. Government. And you see this through trans bathroom issues, where Obama issues a directive through the Department of Education. Let students use the restroom of their choice or you risk losing federal dollars. So it's evolved from cooperative federalism to more of a you are like obliged to cooperate, in effect. Like you either play ball with us or you don't get money. So the worries that the anti-federalists had back to the founding, that the federal government would grow so large and so big it would impose its will on the states, they were shielded by the Supreme Court and their interpretation of the Constitution under the era of dual federalism. But since the New Deal, you have seen the federal government grow larger and larger, more and more powerful, and exerting more and more their will on the states. All right? So that's kind of the big picture takeaway of this, the relationship that existed under dual federalism and the way that it exists now, where the federal government uses them Benjamins to force states to do things or else.
Yeah.
All right? Even though they can't force them, they risk losing federal dollars that they rely on.
Question.
Yes.
Would you say that cooperative federalism was just the seed of
Coercive federalism?
I have problems with my R's. Yeah. Coercive federalism. That would be like just the little plant.
Yeah.
Because the moment you start taking money for things you cannot afford, you now become indebted. And when you're indebted, you're now controlled.
And now the states have become so accustomed to it that they can't afford to not take the money.
Yeah.
So what do? They sue the federal government saying that they're trying to keep the money, and this is, as they found in the Obamacare, the NFIB versus Sebelius, that is too coercive. So that's how they win, to still keep getting the money and not do what the federal government says.
So when did the federal government obtain the money to be able to start these programs?
It started back with the income tax.
Yes.
Yes. Which isn't theft, by the way. Okay.
Started with the income tax.
Okay. So the federal government obviously gets tax revenue from every state in the union, right? Through income tax, through import tax, where state governments, they can have their own income tax, but like Texas, for example, relies on property taxes to fund local things like police and school districts, and the state relies on those sales taxes, right? So, in almost every area of life, you see the federal government's influence in some way. Hello. Excuse me. Right, we fill out FAFSA to go to school, right? We have federal subsidies if you're an undergrad to get loans for your college education. You see some of farm subsidies to make sure that the prices of crops stay stable for consumers as well, so farmers don't go bankrupt. You see all kinds of grants from the federal government, things like Medicaid, which are like formula grants based on population. You see local grants that cities can get for infrastructure, among other things. So Texas sends money to the federal government, and through differing means, trillions of dollars are sent back to the states. So our federal budget last year was around $4.5 trillion. And just looking at what Texas spends in a biennial year, meaning 2 years, but 2 years, we spend about $250 billion. So we're a low tax, low spend state, right? I don't know what California's is, but I shudder to think, all right? And we sent back around $118 billion last year to the federal government just in income taxes, all right? So just to put a little bit of perspective on where is the federal government spending money, how do we get federal money, how does federal money trickle back to the states? Usually it's through government programs and grants, all right? Hold on just one second, let's see where we're at. Okay. So this massive expansion of government in the 1930s and 40s, and then the second, New Deal Part 2, if you will, in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. All right. So some federal programs have developed, a negative stigma, seen as wasteful. Things like a TANF, which is just like cash for poor people. Welfare. People see those as government giving to the undeserving poor, right? So you have people like Ronald Reagan, who was elected took office elected in 1980, and he harped very much on this welfare queen, on like this one woman who had like 7 identities, 8 husbands, and collected $150,000 a year in welfare checks. Now, a lot of research has been done, and that's kind of blown out of proportion, but this common view, that people are sitting around on their ass, not doing anything, and we, the workers, are paying for it, right? So Reagan said we need to quit enabling people to sit at home and be lazy. We need to shrink the size of government. We need to give more power back to the states so that they can use resources how they best see fit. So this is where you see the devolution, or giving authority back to states to do more things, and with block grants, allowing them to spend money and use resources where they will best be utilized. All right? So not one size fits all, Ronald Reagan said. All right? That's his mantra. That we need to let states use resources where they know they will best be utilized, and let states kind of do what they want. So if you hear some conservatives, most conservatives in our state are like anti-marijuana, right? You'll hear that oftentimes. But then you hear people today like there's more moderation, and it's moderating our stances on this horrible, evil drug. And like Ted Cruz says, we should leave it to the states to decide what they want to do. It's okay that some states have it and other states do not. All right. So who's that guy? Barry Obama, right? So Obama had united party government between 2008 and 2010. 2011, you have Republicans sweeping and taking majorities in the House. The Tea Party faction among them, who wanted to throw a wrench in government and stop Obama and the Democrats from spending all this money. Because they're spending trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street and spend our way into prosperity. So they throw a wrench in government. The House of Representatives refuses to more or less pass anything Barack Obama wants, right? Obstructionists is what he would call them. So he said that if you're not going to act, that's cool, then I will act for you. So you see the expansion and routine exercise of executive power, unilateral executive power. So he creates rules through the bureaucracy, issues these mandates through the federal bureaucracy, Department of Education, Department of Labor, and that way he doesn't have to go through Congress to do things. He can make law by just saying so, by writing it down.
Using executive order.
Executive order, absolutely. He'll just executive his order way through life if the Republicans don't want to come to the table and participate. Okay.
He made many.
Huh?
He made many, many, many.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So back to that 10th Amendment, right? Powers are reserved to the states. I get a feeling you're ready to go. I keep hearing zipping. Good, 4 whole minutes. Are you one of the zippers? Are you a zipper? Oh, okay. All right, we'll pick up these last few things on Monday, Tuesday, whatever. I'll see y'all then. I didn't read the thing. Hello, sir. Yeah, so I give you 60 questions, but there's only 50 points for eligible for. So since I don't give a review or any of that stuff, I give you like a 10-point window and you get 10 wrong. Yeah. So the best thing I can say, some things will come from the book. So if you've read the book, some things I just don't mention in class. Mostly I would say will come from the PowerPoint. And certain things I've mentioned, like you hear me repeat the same thing over and over and over again. So certain big ideas I hope that you can catch that are mentioned multiple times. So like with federalism, enumerated, reserved powers, those are important, where they're located, this relationship that exists over time, who defines that relationship, how states rely on the federal government for money. Some things should stand out more than others.
So more concepts, not events.
Like, I'm not asked about the nullification crisis, for example. That's an event, but it ties into the larger, am I gonna, and then like, I could use like the Affordable Care Act. We talked about that a lot at the beginning. Like that might be on there.
Okay.
So I would say worry less about little tiny details, more about, like if I've spent 10 minutes talking about something, like that should stand out. If, the fact that I mentioned, like, I don't think I mentioned like the National Highway Act, like why do we have 21 drinking age? I didn't mention that, so that would be like more of a small thing, and I probably would not ask about that, for example.
Okay, thank you.
No, sir.
I was gonna ask you, I haven't been here the past 4 days.
Oh, okay.
The past 4 questions.
Yeah.
But, what all, like, is everything just due and everything on Blackboard?
Yeah, just send you an email that you missed the first day participation. Other than that, we
No,
just.
I was there the first day.
Oh, then you're good. Yeah, other than that, you've not missed, grade-wise, you're fine. Have a good day, Caleb.
Thank you, Professor. As to you. Holy shit. 1